Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. As the title of this video suggests, we're discussing Julian Assange, and we're discussing him in the context of renunciation of U.S. citizenship. These two topics would seemingly be so disparate that they would not really warrant a video like this because, the juxtaposition, I could see where someone would argue, what's one have to do with the other? Well, let's jump in here. I thought of making this video after reading a recent article from AP News, that's apnews.com. Article is titled, WikiLeaks founder Assange wins right to appeal against an extradition order to the U.S. Not going to get into Assange's case, not the purpose of this video. A lot of other people out there have talked about it. Reasonable people can have their own opinions on it. My personal opinion is I question whether or not U.S. authorities have actual jurisdiction over Assange, and I'll get into that further here in a moment. Quoting further, Assange's lawyers have argued he was a journalist who exposed U.S. military wrongdoing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Sending him to the U.S., they said, would expose him to a politically motivated prosecution and risk a, quote, flagrant denial of justice, unquote. The U.S. government says Assange's actions went way beyond those of a journalist gathering information, amounting to an attempt to solicit, steal, and indiscriminately publish classified government documents. The brief ruling from the bench followed arguments over Assange's claims that by releasing the confidential documents, he was essentially a publisher and due to free press protections guaranteed by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. But the counter-argument to that is, hey, you're a non-U.S. citizen, non-U.S. resident, non-U.S. national living outside of the United States. You're a non-resident alien, is basically the assertion. And they're saying, you're not a U.S. citizen. You don't have the protections of the First Amendment. That's the way I'm understanding this case. This case's posture, basically, is if Assange was an American citizen, there'd be no question he'd have certain First Amendment rights. But the fact that he's not precludes him from exercising those rights. That's how I understand this. Now, the paradox is here, it's my understanding he's never been to the U.S., he doesn't have any connections to the U.S., he's not an American citizen. So how does the U.S. have jurisdiction to try to drag him back into the United States? That's a different question. My personal opinion is I don't really think that they do, and I think that's fairly clear. But that said, the reason, oftentimes you got to remember the saying, the process is the punishment, or as friends of mine in law enforcement have said, you may beat the rap, but you won't beat the ride. It's the process is the punishment. And believe me, Julian Assange going through this process has been severely punished for the things that he has done in the past. Now, whether you think that those were warranted or whether you think that those were acts that deserve punishment, again, people disagree on that. My personal opinion is he looks a lot like a journalist to me, but I don't want to get into that here. The point I am trying to make, though, is, again, if he's a non-U.S. citizen not living in the United States, it's a hard argument, in my mind, that he can assert rights as an American citizen. Again, does the First Amendment pertain to a non-U.S. citizen not on U.S. soil? It's a good question. I don't think it does, actually, for the same reason I don't think they have jurisdiction over him. So again, it's kind of circular and paradoxical. But the point I'm trying to make for those, again, it's something that really bugs me in the so-called nomad community, expat community, that people talk about renunciation of U.S. citizenship in a very cavalier manner. And it always seems to be talked about in the context or rubric of taxes. It's, oh, I got to get out from under these taxes, so I gotta renounce my citizenship. I don't think people fully understand the ramifications of waiving one's privileges and immunities of U.S. citizenship. And I think this Assange case is very illustrative of the risks associated with renunciation. Now, again, not everybody is going to go out there and want to be Julian Assange and dump a bunch of confidential, government information onto the open sort of market of the internet, if you will, in order to try and, be an activist or something of this nature. I get that. Not everyone is Julian Assange. So you may not necessarily be able to make apples to apples comparisons between, somebody who wants to renounce and Julian Assange. And more importantly, there isn't anything wrong per se with renunciation. I'm not saying that the idea of renouncing one's citizenship is somehow inherently bad. But as I've said in videos in the past, and I've said to people in the past, it does have a tendency to sort of paint a target on a person's back, especially from the standpoint of scrutiny and accessibility with regard to tax liability. Yeah, they tend to scrutinize those folks that much more. Meanwhile, again, it's unwise, or maybe I should say imprudent, to cavalierly overlook the privileges and immunities associated with U.S. citizenship. And one of those privileges and immunities are on display in this Assange case, insofar as if he had been an American citizen, this whole case would be moot. They would have just said, I think most of it, probably most of it would be moot. Some aspects of this, maybe, maybe not. Again, the Espionage Act comes into play. But a lot of this would be moot. They would basically just say, hey, he's an American citizen, he's operating as a journalist, First Amendment, what are we talking about here? But he's not, and that's the point. And when you renounce your U.S. citizenship, you cease to be a U.S. citizen. When you renounce your citizenship, I should have said. At that point, your privileges and immunities are no longer there. They're no longer attached to you. So again, there may be some people who it's the reasonable decision in their circumstances to renounce their citizenship, but there's a lot of people out there, especially in the ether of the internet, that talk about these issues in a very flippant, very cavalier manner, and they don't really fully understand the ramifications that can come about by renunciation of one's U.S. citizenship.